Drinking Water present you, on the one hand, the current 1998 directive with its objectives, key elements, state of drinking water supply. I would then cover the issue of water as a human rights and water affordability, because even the best of quality of drinking water is not of much use if citizens can't afford it. And finally, the new Drinking Water Directive, what is the state of play and what are the key elements we have to expect for the new Drinking Water Directive and when? The current, still valid Drinking Water Directive of 1998 has the objectives, of course, it's self-explaining, providing safe drinking water. Its scope is all water supplies serving more than 50 consumers or delivering more than 10 cubic meters of drinking water per day. It also covers drinking water from bottles, but not mineral water, drinking water from containers as you find them in meeting venues, some offices and so, and drinking water from tankers. Sounds weird, but some years ago, the island of Cyprus suffered a disastrous water scarcity, leading to water being imported to Cyprus from Greece on the one hand and from Turkey on the other hand to supply Cypriots with drinking water. And finally, is water used in the food processing industry, footnote, where drinking water quality is required. Washing trucks in a food processing company does not require drinking water quality. The directive sets binding drinking water quality standards for microbiological and for chemical parameters. It provides an obligation to regularly monitor drinking water quality and to take remedial action in case this monitoring reveals problems. The information of consumer is rather limited. To recall, this is a directive which is now 22 years old, and one of the reasons for developing a new drinking water directive was also that the information is a bit weird. It is limited, for instance, that data from drinking water quality are only reported to the Commission after almost 4 years, and only for the supplies serving more than 5,000 people. It means the Commission can publish a report. This might be of scientific interest, it might be about looking for trends, but it is not as opposed, for instance, to the Basin Water Directive, where you get last year's results this year published. And it is not in any way addressing smaller water supplies. And if I, as a citizen, live in a city of, say, 3,000 people, I would feel entitled to the same level of information and of protection as those living in bigger cities. Finally, the provisions on sampling and analysis in the directive were outdated, and they were, even before the general revision of the directive, updated in 2015. In your documentation, you have a consolidated version putting together the 1998 directive and the revision of 2015. So this is an up-to-date document. If you look at drinking water quality at the EU, you have, of course, to look also where does the drinking water come from. It's quite different. We have countries which have 100% groundwater or spring water as the source. Examples are, for instance, Denmark or Austria. You have other countries where a lot of drinking water comes from inland waters, from surface waters, either directly or via bank filtration. And you find countries where coastal waters after desalination plays a major role. This is, for instance, the case in Malta, where more than 50% of the water supplied to drinking water users comes from desalination, and in Spain or in Cyprus. If we look at the quality of drinking water, for the larger supplies, supplying more than 5,000 consumers or citizens, you see a compliance rate with microbiological and chemical parameters of more than 99%. So looking at that, for the bigger supplies, the Drinking Water Directive is a European success story. However, if you look at the smaller supplies, supplying between 50 and 5,000 people, the picture is quite different. And it's also different depending on the management structure of the country involved. To give an example, the Netherlands, with 16 million inhabitants, is served with drinking water by 10 publicly owned water companies, and they serve both big cities like Den Haag, Rotterdam, or Amsterdam, but also tiny villages outside in the country. By comparison, Bavaria, one of the Länder or regions of Germany, had about 12 million inhabitants and has 3,500 water companies. Big ones like Munich or Augsburg or Nuremberg, but also tiny ones serving only a handful of 100, 200, 300, 500 citizens. You can see, therefore, that the management, technical and scientific experience, and the budgetary power between the water companies can be different if you look at the system in the Netherlands and the one with tiny utilities. Germany is one example, Austria another one, and a lot of rural France as well has rather tiny supplies. Nevertheless, the question how you organize yourself in big water utilities or in smaller ones is a decision left to the countries, depending on the constitution at the national or the regional level. There is no legal basis and no political intention for the union to interfere in that. Needless to say, as I said earlier, the question of property ownership can never be addressed by EU legislation, neither with qualified majority or with unanimity in the European Parliament or in the Council. This is left to member states. Nevertheless, coming back to drinking water, citizens, this is my opinion, are entitled to safe drink water regardless whether they live in one of the 27 EU countries and whether they live in a small settlement or in a big settlement. This is something of a challenge for the future, water quality in small supplies. This then refers in particular to microbiological quality and to pollution by nitrates and or pesticides. If we talk about drinking water, a further point to bear in mind is also drinking water supply leakages. You have quite a range of leakage rates across Europe, from the champions in the Netherlands and Germany with 6 or 7% leakage rate to more than 40 and up to 50%. In certain parts of the United Kingdom, not a member state anymore. In big cities like London, the leakage rate is still 40%. It means out of every cubic meter which is abstracted, treated to quality standards, chemical and microbiological, and then pumped into the system, 400 liters or 40% of that drinking water is lost via leaking piping system, which partly date back to the time before the First World War. I'm sure you will agree that there are better methods of recharging groundwater than by leaking drink water pipes. Water has increasingly been addressed as a human right, and this is true both for the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, which after the Lisbon Treaty has been given the level of a part of the treaties like the other treaties. And you can see the right to live, the right to integrity of the person and of environmental protection are established human rights under this charter, which of course is a constitutional principle, which as national constitutions have then to be translated or transformed into day-to-day policy and legislation. The European Pillar of Social Rights, jointly proclaimed less than 3 years ago by Parliament, Commission and Council, states in Article 20, everyone has the right to access essential services, including water, sanitation, energy, transport, financial services. Support for access to such services shall be available for those in need. This is the theory. I will later on elaborate how the same European Parliament and Council delivered on this right to access for essential services, including water and sanitation, in practice when debating and deciding on the new Drinking Water Directive. The European Convention on Human Rights, which is not an EU instrument, but a convention adopted in the framework of the Council of Europe, which has 46 member states, which are basically all European countries with the exception of Belarus, even before the recent presidential elections. And this Convention on Human Rights states, on the one hand, the right to life, which in the case law of the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg states it entails a positive obligation for the countries to take appropriate steps to safeguard the lives of those in their jurisdiction. It means the public authorities have a duty to take steps to guarantee. There's currently a case ongoing at the European Court of Human Rights of several Slovenian citizens requesting that the government supplies them with drinking water. And another article in the same convention, the right to respect for private and family life and home, also says that severe environmental pollution and so is a human right. You have a human right to be protected from those. Finally, the Water Framework Directive, the flagship of EU water legislation, starts with the sentence, water is not a commercial product like any other, but rather a heritage which must be protected, which also shows that the high value of water for policymakers at the European level. In this context, it's worth mentioning that there is an EU obligation to provide wastewater collection for all settlements except the small ones below 2,000 people, or the equivalent in wastewater, whereas the Drinking Water Directive contains no legal obligation to provide drinking water supply, neither does the agreed new directive. There is therefore quite an asymmetric situation, obligation for countries, authorities to provide wastewater collection, but no obligation to provide drinking water. The Drinking Water Directive, old and new one, only are in force where there is a drinking water supply system, what is What is missing, in my humble opinion, is a clear parallel obligation to provide drinking water supply to all citizens. And there might be certain exemptions, such as if you have a sound water supply yourself, you should not be forced to pipe drinking water from 5 kilometers away. Closely linked to the right of water is water affordability. The United Nations 9 years ago adopted at the level of the General Assembly a threshold value of 5%. The cost for water and sanitation, that is drinking water and wastewater, should not exceed 5% of a household income. It means there must be enough left to feed your children, to cover schooling costs, health services, and others. If you look at the figures across Europe, the figure of 5% is for the average net disposable income, not in any way far reached. You have values from 0.2 to about 1.2%, from Iceland to Belgium. However, if you look at the less off people, that means the lowest, in statistical terms, the lowest decile income, you see that the poorer people in certain countries clearly have a problem covering their living, because their drinking water and sanitation bill is well beyond the 5,000, whereas in the majority of European countries, it is between 1 and 3% only. Again, in terms of human rights, drinking water affordability is not in any way covered by EU legislation. The Water Framework Directive sets minimum prices, basically linked to cost recovery, but it doesn't utter one sentence about what it can be the maximum price. Nevertheless, there are countries like, for instance, my new home country, Belgium, who show that the question of cost recovery can easily be accommodated with social aspects. In Belgium, you have a stage tariff. The first batch of drinking water is free of charge. The next one has a certain price. And if you go into luxury consumption, say more than 120 or 150 liters per head and day, then you pay more. In total, it means the costs are recovered, but those who earn less get a considerable part of their water supply free of charge. As I said, the Drinking Water Directive is more than 20 years old. It is dated 1998. It is based on a legislative proposal of 1995. Therefore, it reflects the managerial, political, and technical knowledge of the early 1990s. And definitely, it is more than outdated. This is true for certain quality standards. It's true for the involvement of the public and public consultation, but it's also true for the whole approach to management. So what happened was a consultation with the public, with stakeholders, the scientific community and member states for 3 years to look what can and what should be done with a view to a new drinking water directive. In early 2018, the Commission presented on the 1st of February its legislative proposal. A bit more than a year later, the European Parliament concluded its first reading, followed by the Council, so the other chamber of the legislator, setting out its so-called general approach, which is basically the key ideas of the Council of Ministers. In October 2019, a so-called trilogue between European Parliament, Council and Commission started to find common ground and a compromise without going into a second reading or a conciliation procedure. In December 2019, such a political agreement was found. It has in the meantime also been approved in the Environment Committee of the European Parliament. What then happened end of February, as you all know, COVID-19 struck, and the process was rather struck with Council and European Parliament and Commission work severely hampered by restrictions and lockdowns. We stand now in October 2020. What we're waiting for is the finalization in the European Parliament and the Council. What currently is ongoing is a legal and linguistic scrutiny whether all the language versions from Estonian to Portuguese and from English to Finnish are correct and reflect each other, because at the end, each of the language versions of the final directive has the same power and the same weight. What are the key changes in the final text now agreed? And you have this final text also in the documentation you will be able to download. On access to drinking water for all, as already mentioned, this is a major disappointment, not least against the promises, in particular by the European Parliament, on the European Citizens' Initiative Right to Water. Is a vague commitment without any deadline. So contrary to the wastewater legislation, where it states you must have your wastewater system in place by a certain time and they must function as follows, you find only vague commitments such as member states shall work towards expanding the access to drinking water. The scope is largely maintained. It now includes also water supply from ships with desalination as source. Cruising was, at least in the 1990s, not a major industry. It has, at least before COVID-19, been a major one with a lot of turnover and income, be it for the communities, being for the shipping industry. The parameters and values of the directive have been updated, and the obligation for countries to add, where necessary for health reasons, further parameters for the whole territory or for part of it has been maintained. If you look at the values, they are more stringent, that is lower values for lead and for chromium-6, and the values for antimony and boron have been loosened based on scientific evidence. The whole process was also supported by the World Health Organization with expertise. Additional parameters, which were not a major issue in 1995 or 1998, are now taken, which is bisphenol A, a typical chemical substance with a potential pollution factor, polyfluorinated substances PFAS, and uranium, and for domestic distribution systems, Legionella, which is a microbiological pollutant which appears and develops only in warm water circuits, therefore in domestic distribution systems. This can be hotels, this can be schools, this can be recreational homes. The values for pesticides and nitrates have maintained, and there was also no question to loosen them. That means the pesticides value of 0.1 microgram per liter of the 1998 directive is maintained, as is the total value for all pesticides together of 0.5 microgram per liter. The value for nitrate is maintained as well with 50 milligram per liter, basically providing, based on the evaluation also of the Water Framework Directive, safe drinking water. If you drink drinking water with 50 milligram nitrate per liter, from the cradle to the grave, you will be on the safe side. What is missing, and having worked in implementation quite a lot, I deplore this deeply. There's no mutual recognition of suitable alternative monitoring provisions. To explain, for every parameter, a certain value based on ISO norms, European norms, or others is set out. With the next sentence stating, member states may allow alternative methods. So if a university has developed a quicker, a more efficient, more precise and cheaper method, they can allow to use that. However, this is only done per country. That means if in Sweden an alternative analytical system is developed and approved by the government, replacing the standard provision in the directive, that's fine. But such an agreement by the government of Sweden is not valid in Portugal, in Estonia, in Cyprus, or in Ireland. It means you need, depending on the constitutional framework, in Germany, 16 different agreements from the regional governments. You need in Italy 51 regional governments improvements, and in Spain more than a dozen as well, which makes development and application of alternative systems serving the same purpose rather complicated and expensive for citizens. The sampling frequencies in the new directive are staged according to the size of the water supply system in certain groups, supplying less than 10 cubic meter per day, which means 50 consumers, 10 to 100, 100 to 1,000, and the big ones then above 100,000 cubic meters, which equals supply areas of about 500,000 people.
Can I ask questions?
Of course, anytime.
Connected to that slide. The first one is regarding the, as I remember it, this access to drinking water for all.
Yeah.
It was a quite distinguished wish from the public consultation. So what is the reason why there is only a vague commitment?
Yeah, well, I cannot answer this question. I deplore this decision. The answer can be given by the European Parliament and by the Council of Ministers.
Okay, so it's a result of negotiations.
It's the results of political negotiations between the Parliament and the Council, so the two legislators. And I say it's against the background of earlier commitments, but also against the background of the European Citizens' Initiative Right to Water. I find this very, very disappointing. Also, it's interesting, if you look at the map of the European Union, you have in most countries a supply coverage of far more than 95%, access to drinking water, piped drinking water from public supplies. You have a major problem in rural Romania. That means outside the cities. You have a supply coverage of about 40%, and you have in parts of eastern Croatia and of eastern Slovakia also rather limited access to supply. On top of that, frequently marginalized groups like Sinti and Roma settlements are in many cases excluded from public water supply for whatever formal reasons. So this is deplorable, and it has not in any way been taken up in the last 20 years. Again, we have the asymmetric situation that we have an obligation for wastewater collection and treatment, a very good one and a very successful one, but we have no obligation to supply citizens with foodstuff number one, that is with drinking water.
Okay, and looking at the issue from a sustainable point of view, I think because I work with the Water Framework Directive, and I see there will be a lot of effort needed to be able to secure the sustainable drinking water supply maybe in the future due to increased stress or pressure on the water bodies, groundwater bodies, surface water bodies. It will be needed measures are needed.
Yeah, I agree. Water quantity has in the past 10 years already become increasingly a major challenge, and it is now not limited to the island of Cyprus or Malta or typical Mediterranean coastal areas. My new home country, Belgium, for instance, has a rather stressed water management system because the groundwater bodies are rather limited, and the abstraction from surface water is already rather high. The same is, for instance, true for England. England has a reputation of a country where it's permanently raining. However, the southeast of England, the London and Kent area, suffer under extreme water stress because the groundwater bodies are not in any way too productive. And the only major river there, the River Thames, is already subject to enormous abstraction. It led for the British authorities to the decision in a country with a reputation of permanent rain to install a desalination plant at the mouth of the River Thames, in the estuary of the River Thames, to cover peak demand during the summer season. So water scarcity will become a problem, and this leads me also back to the question of leakage. We cannot afford pumping water out of groundwater or of surface waters and pump it across dozens of kilometers without looking at the outdated, worn-out supply system, which partly dates back to the time before the First World War. This cannot be sustainable. We must do it differently. There are also positive elements in looking at leakage management. To give an example, 20 years ago, the city of Barcelona in Spain suffered from severe water shortage. And at that time, the idea right from the shelf was, well, we look for a big river and pipe the water to Barcelona. There was even a pre-project already of piping 1% of the low flow of the River Rhône, which has its estuary on the southern coast of France, along the southern coast of France, into Catalonia, and then into the distribution system of Barcelona. It would probably not have harmed the ecological balance of the delta of the Rhône River. However, the authorities in Barcelona looked at the source of the problem and found that with much less cost and more sustainable solution can be found in repairing the distribution system and drastically cutting the leakage rate, which at that time partly was 50% and more. And there's no pipeline from the Rhone estuary to Barcelona now, and the water supply system of Barcelona is for the time being in balance. But I fully agree with you, water quantity management will be a major challenge for the future. And the Water Framework Directive should give us, if the political will is there, the necessary instruments to look at that.
Okay, a last question about the sampling frequency. It's now changed. As I know, I mix it up with the monitoring frequencies from the Water Framework Directive. How member states are supposed to monitor the quality in the water bodies if they are providing with more than according to the Water Framework Directive, you are supposed to monitor the supply with more than 10,000 cubic meters, I think. So this is the sampling frequencies in the tap water.
The new drinking water directive tries to align the provisions with those of the Water Framework Directive. It means also that, for instance, the risk assessment for a drinking water supply system is now done across the catchment, taking into account all the data and the experience already available under the implementation of the Water Framework Directive. The old Drinking Water Directive basically stated only if you open your tap as a consumer, the water must have the following quality, and then comes a list of 58 parameters, full stop. In the future, as many countries and many municipalities already do now, they look into the catchment, try to minimize impacts there in terms of quality and quantity, and then feed this into the drinking water supply system. The new sampling frequencies under the Drinking Water Directive you will find in the document final text, new Drinking Water Directive in the documentation. They are of course different for a small hamlet with 50 or 100 inhabitants compared to a city like Stockholm, Lisbon, or Milano. At the end of the day, it is also, of course, a political compromise with the Council and the European Parliament, where you can expect that the mayors and councils of municipalities have been lobbying their country's governments. Please don't overburden us with sampling and monitoring costs. At the same time, also as in a small city, as a citizen, as a consumer, you should be entitled to a rather safe drinking water supply.
Yeah, thank you.
And therefore, what should not happen is parallel efforts that basically the drinking water authorities run out into the countryside and discover that there's a catchment to their water supply and start collecting data which are available around the corner by those people who dealt since the year 2000 with river basin management and catchment management under the Water Framework Directive. I think this correlation and coherence between Drinking Water Directive and Water Framework Directive has been a rather successful legislative exercise. The one on access to drinking water, to my experience, and I think to yours as well, definitely was disappointing. Okay, are there further questions on drinking water? Anything from the new Drinking Water Directive to affordability or quality of drinking water?
I think Anneli may have a question.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm curious about how the Water Framework Directive have the necessary instruments for quantity for surface water, or did you say the Drinking Water Directive?
Well, imagine there wouldn't be a Drinking Water Directive. The Water Framework Directive sets out obligation to have a monitoring program for surface waters and for groundwaters on a regular basis, based on certain parameters. However, the Water Framework Directive is about ecological quality of waters. Therefore, you will not find an obligation to monitor on microbiological parameters like Escherichia coli or intestinal enterococci or colony-forming bacteria. This you will only find in the Drinking Water Directive. However, all the knowledge about the river basins we have now compared to 30 years ago, where in many countries there was close to zero catchment knowledge and experience, can feed into the system of securing drinking water supply and only complementing sampling and monitoring on microbiological and other parameters. Of course, also the sampling frequencies will be different in a river compared to drinking water quality. Give an example, the city of Brussels has a source of its drinking water supply. 50% is groundwater from Wallonia, and 50% is surface water from the river Meuse. And it is clear that the drinking water quality is monitored on a daily basis, looking at the chemical and the microbiological parameters, not least to optimize the treatment, whereas the river Maas or the groundwater in Wallonia are monitored on a largely routine basis. At the same time, water abstraction areas, be it from surface water, be it from groundwater, which serve as the basis for drinking water supply, enjoy particular protection under the Water Framework Directive in its Article 7. That means, apart from the general provisions of Article 4, keep your waters clean. Those waters used for drinking water in abstraction or intended for such use, that means future caption areas, enjoy particular protection, and member states are obliged to put beyond the standard water protection measures, including bans on certain activities or others in place for such caption areas.
I have a question about parameters. For example, nitrate or nitrate. Is it the same level for all drinking water in Europe, or are there different levels? And this is regulated by the EU?
No. Yeah. The Drinking Water Directive sets quality standards at the tap, regardless whether this is a small municipality or the city of Paris. So you mentioned nitrate. The value of 50 milligram nitrate per liter is the maximum permissible value, regardless whether this is a small village or whether this is a city of several million inhabitants. Because also the health of the consumers, of the citizens, is not to be divided between big and small cities.
Sure. And are using different countries different limits, so lower limits?
Like for all environmental legislation, the treaty establishes that member states can impose, that means invent, or maintain stricter standards if they want. give an example. In Finland, the nitrate value is not 50 milligram per liter, but 25 milligram per liter. Footnote why? There is not a major agricultural problem, and they can simply use this on the basis of precautionary principle. However, such stricter values may not be in conflict with the sacred four freedoms of the European Union, which is freedom of movement, it's irrelevant, freedom of capital, freedom of enterprise, and free movement of goods. Free movement of goods could be interesting. It means if a country has a lower value than 50 milligram per liter, it would not be allowed to restrict the import of bottled water, which has, say, 35 milligram nitrate per liter, which is a largely theoretical question because bottled water that is exported usually has nitrate values far below that. But again, for all environmental legislation, you might adopt stricter standards, which is, for instance, also the case for the next thing we will touch, which is wastewater treatment. The Wastewater Directive sets minimum requirement and allows member states to adopt or maintain stricter standards. They can do so. And this happens to a certain extent.
I would like to raise another question, if it's possible.
Yeah.
I read your background paper, and page 24, this is about the revisions in the new directive, or Drinking Water Directive. On page 24, you are making some bullet points about what is revised in the latest suggestions. There is this bullet point about hazard assessment linked to Article 7 in the Water Framework Directive.
Yeah.
Which is very good, I think, for us working with the Water Framework Directive in Sweden. We have been longing for this more clear linkage between how to manage the water bodies and to be able to have a sustainable drinking water production. But bullet point below, it said that no general obligation for national authorities to agree risk assessments by water utilities was replaced by may in Article 9.2.
Yeah.
How should I understand that?
How is it to be interpreted? I would say the Commission proposed that the risk assessments would have to be approved by authorities, and the political debate in Council and Parliament delivered that such an obligation was not seen as very sexy.
Okay, means that the water utilities do have an obligation to make risk assessments, including both quantity and quality of water. They are not obliged to give the information to national authorities.
Yeah, I think at the end, it will depend on how citizens, authorities, stakeholders, and NGOs work in reality. I think if a water utility adopts a risk assessment which is out of touch with reality, neglects major challenges, it will not last. It will be highlighted in the public, in the discussion, and there will be pressure to change or amend such a risk assessment. Of course, I agree with you that the version originally in the legislative proposal by the Commission, that the authorities, which authority is the choice of member states, have to bless, to approve such a risk assessment would have been better. But yeah, at the end, it's a political process, and we have to live with the compromise which Parliament and Council found, which reflects not 100% of the position of the member states and not 100% of the position of the European Parliament. But as in any political process, be it on a local municipality level, at the regional level, or the European level, at the end, there's a compromise which, as a rule, does not satisfy 100% of all requests and aspirations.
Yeah, it's true. So it's also a question of information that we national authorities should provide citizens, and because and there is also some obligations to inform the public about the risk assessment and the monitoring.
Yeah. And also, of course, under all EU legislation, the public has the right of access to environmental information, and the risk assessments for drinking water supplies are without any doubt environmental information. That means you have an enforceable right to get the information. Even as a small citizen, Mr. Blöch or Mr. Miller, you can get it. And this access to justice by a citizen has also, I will later elaborate on the Nitrates Directive, also been supported and expanded by the Court of Justice in critical procedures where member states obviously were unwilling to work on the demands and requests, legitimate demands of citizens and municipalities.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.